have, there we go. We're at the top of the hour. I'm sure that we will have more attendees continue to roll in, but I will get us started because today is quite the action-packed agenda, tackling the importance of politics and policy and how those influence our New York real estate. My name is Brian Tormey, and I'm the president of TitleVest and the New York State and Regional Manager for First American Title. And before we dive into introductions and sort of going through things at the head of the session, I just wanted to acknowledge and speak to the tragedies occurring overseas from us here in the U.S., in Israel, and express our deepest and most heartfelt sympathies and prayers for health and a return to good status as easily and safely as possible for everyone involved. So our hearts are with everyone over there dealing with these issues and the people here in the US who have family and friends there. With that, I will start diving into our session today. As I said, it's a pretty exciting one. We've got a couple regulars on this webinar. Heather and Jonathan and Richard have all, well, Richard, it's sort of your gig, but today we've got you as a panelist, which is very exciting. And we've also got a new guest, Mike Kelly, whom we're very excited to have join us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard to wear one of his two hats today, as he is both a host as well as I'll be grilling him as a panelist here in a little bit. But for the moment, Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you as host.
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Be Your Best series, our webinar series to share best practices for getting real estate deals done in New York. I'm Richard Haggerty, CEO of One Key MLS, the comprehensive multiple listing service for the New York region. One Key has more than 46,000 subscribers and serves the region from Montauk to Manhattan to Monticello. One Key hosts the Be Your Best series with the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors, which represents more than 14,000 real estate professionals in Manhattan, the Bronx, Westchester, Putnam, Rockland, and Orange counties. We all know that real estate is the driving economic force in New York, and politics can have a significant impact on our industry. Today, we'll take a look at the New York's political landscape and share what you need to know to get deals done. As always, Brian, thank you. Brian Tormey, president of TitleVest, for partnering with us on this series and moderating our panel discussions. TitleVest is a leading New York City-based title insurance agency and a member of the First American family. TitleVest offers a full range of services for real estate property purchase and refinance transactions. With offices in Manhattan and Westchester, TitleVest engages in transactions upstate, downstate, and nationwide. TitleVest has won the New York Law Journal's Best Title Agency for the last 10 years. And now let's meet our panel. We're pleased to have with us Heather Domi, the founding chair of NYRAC, the New York Residential Agent Continuum. NYRAC advocates for the New York City residential real estate profession. Heather is also a licensed associate real estate broker at Compass. Also joining us is Jonathan Greenspun. Jonathan is the managing director of Mercury Public Affairs, a public strategy firm with offices in New York and nationwide. And also, we have Mike Kelly, who is the government affairs director for the New York State Association of Realtors, and we're thrilled to have all of you. Heather, Mike, Jonathan, welcome so much. Welcome and thank you for being here. And Brian, I'm turning it back to you.
Okay, great. We'll do a couple quick housekeeping items. For our audience here live today, we very much encourage questions, especially on some of these topics that have a lot of moving parts to them. We've got a panel of experts here to answer your questions. We encourage you to use the Q&A function within Zoom. For most of you, that'll be two little chat bubbles down at the bottom of your screen that you can click into and type in your question. Feel free, please do include your name so I can sort of speak to who is asking each question, and put them there. You're welcome to also use the chat function to sort of add commentary and you know, agreement or dissent, possibly with the opinions being expressed. But please try to queue up your questions you'd like answered in the Q&A function. Voices are also welcome. We've broadly got everyone muted, but if you need to in your question, you can sort of say, please unmute me for the question. So with that, Richard, before we dive into content, we always get an amazing monthly update from you on stats and market moves. It is, you know, well, I'm not going to add conjecture yet. Why don't you give us the numbers and then we'll sort of have some commentary on that.
Well, Brian, you can go ahead and conject, and I'm sure your conjecture is going to be dead on. I wish I had better news. Yeah, just a broad overview. In terms of our whole region, which, as we said, covers a very broad region that's New York City and the residential areas surrounding it, suburban areas. We're looking compared to last year, we're down about 21%.
Mhm.
Um, what's a little bit discouraging is I really thought that number would start to level off because, as we've mentioned before, we had such a significant churning of activity after COVID, and the market just took off. And I've often pointed out we can't compare today's market to what was happening during that period because it was just, we're not going to, I don't think, see that type of market activity again. However, that the slowdown from that really high point really started to happen in the third quarter of last year. So I think we're starting to compare apples to apples, and we're
Mhm.
still down about 20%. And it's the same old culprits, quite frankly. It's extremely tight inventory that's really also caused by obviously the interest rates. And as we pointed out before, we keep on hearing that the interest rates, quite frankly, are not uh, really impacting buyers in a significant way. They still want to buy. It's sellers who are looking around saying, I don't want to lose my low interest rate. And furthermore, there's nothing out there that's intriguing me because there's no inventory. So, I think we're going to sound like a broken record, quite frankly, for the balance of this year. And hopefully we'll start to see an upturn in 2024.
Yeah, I'm curious, Richard, are you seeing, and Heather, you may have commentary also from the brokerage space. One of the, anecdotal trends I've been hearing in the market, and I'm curious if the data and other people's experiences are bearing this out, is those homeowners who own a home and seek to move, right? Whether that's upsizing, downsizing, relocating, et cetera. But as you said, Richard, and I'll sort of, add in the phrase that I like using, is they're like interest rate locked in a different way, right? They're interest rate locked into their home. Um, they're putting their home, which is not typically a rental type property, right? They wouldn't have planned to rent it, but more whole sort of family sized homes of higher caliber are also going into the rental market, and they're seeking and starting to look, as it's almost like a chicken and egg, but it's starting to get going. There are other family style homes in the rental market as well, so that they're able to rent theirs and move to that upsize, downsize, changing school districts kind of move kind of thing. Is the data like, those are anecdotals I've been receiving? Is the
The
data starting
data
to support
totally
that?
supports that. I actually did an interview with the national publication about a week ago. So I ran some rental numbers,
Mhm.
and residential rentals now make up more than a third of our entire residential marketplace. So I'm
Volume.
talking about single family condo co-op for sale properties. In that whole mix, residential rentals are a third of the market right now, which I
Yeah.
think is a staggering number.
Right. And to help baseline for people, like what is probably like a more, 5 years ago, what's a standard number for that?
I would hazard a guess probably much more in the 10% range.
Yeah.
I really
So
think
it's
it's gone that
tripling.
high.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Heather, does your experience start to echo that as well?
I think we're seeing it if sellers aren't getting the numbers that they want,
Hmm.
and there's still a number of people that are needing to rent, right? Because if
Hmm.
there's not the inventory and a specific purchaser can't find something to buy, but they need somewhere to live, they're going to end up renting. So then, I have a townhouse that I just rented on the Upper East Side that we rented for an exceedingly high number, just because they couldn't find anything else, and they approached us, and it was kind of like we weren't on the market for rent, and now it is rented. But I just think it's like it's pushing people, the lack of inventory is pushing people into rental choices because they've got to do something, and life continues, right? Like I guess Robert Refkin was on Bloomberg, and the 5 Ds: divorce, diapers, diplomas,
Yeah.
death, and
Yeah.
I'm missing one
They
more,
don't
but
stop.
it's true. So
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. So that's a trend and pattern we're sort of seeing in the data, and the experiential is bearing it out too. Well, with that, let's turn. This is great insights. I'm excited to get into our content here. Heather, I'm gonna start. I'm gonna come to you and start with you to talk a little bit about, right. So our core audience here are real estate agents, realtors, brokers, and I want to think and talk about what for that populace has political action within their industry, as opposed to sort of personal political action, has not always historically been a high percentage of their activity, right? Broadly speaking. As I sit here at my industry's trade conference, and last night was, at one of our political action committee fundraisers, so for my industry, there's been a longstanding history of a lot of activity. You've been helping lead a charge through NIRAC, this organization that you helped co-found, to help spur that kind of activity at an individual basis, not just at sort of an association level, but also at that individual level. Can you talk us through a little bit of that, NIRAC, its engagement, some historic examples of how that's worked to sort of help spark the minds of our audience here today about how they too can be really involved in these things. And then we'll dig into some of the topics with Jonathan and Mike, and some of the topics why they should be involved.
Right, certainly. So I apologize. I am at home today and I have a senile dog that barks for no reason. So
but it's very cute. So
very
that
cute,
makes
very
up for it.
cute. So I'm sorry if you hear her, I just can't stop her. But yeah, so NIRAC is an organization of agents. We got together back in 2018. We felt there was a void in the market as far as agents having a level of connectivity, and maybe like our voice is not necessarily being heard in a way that that spoke just for agents, right? I mean, there's so many different sides of the industry. There's the agents, there's the brokerages, there's the consumer. So, there were some very specific issues that became very important as we formed this group, right? I think the original idea was more of social connectivity, and it really became something more, and it became more about advocacy. And we call ourselves a group of civically minded agents. And, as a result, there are a lot of people, a lot of agents in our city that are passionate about politics and the industry. And we've been doing this for a long time. So also, how do we give back? And I think for so many years, the real estate boards, like, we pay our dues and they take care of all of the political side of things, and it's taken care of, and we don't, people turn off their emails because they feel like they get too many emails, so they're not getting the emails from Rebney or maybe HCAR, and they're missing out on a lot of information. And so I think there ends up being this disconnect between what our organizations are doing for us and then how we can get involved. And so we've kind of started to bring that together. And when an issue comes up, whether it was the pied-à-terre tax, that was a hot issue a few years ago, the cap on broker fees, 421A, whatever that issue might be, we've tried to get involved. And speaking with local politics, we sat down with Keith Powers back 4 or 5 years ago when the broker cap thing started. We went up to Albany and met with a lot of legislators. Jonathan Greenspan has represented us and helped us through all of that as well. And it's been a very fulfilling process to know that our voice actually matters. The reality is, and what I've learned and what we've seen and experienced, is that most people don't take action because, again, they rely on somebody else to do it. So when you're relying on somebody else to do it, it's just like, oh, I paid my dues, it's taken care of. Well, when individual constituents actually start contacting their local legislative people, whether it's city council or state representatives, and it starts happening large
Mhm.
numbers, then you start to move the needle and people start to listen, because the last
Yeah.
thing that our representatives want is to start hearing from us.
Yeah.
So it is not that hard to do. There are easy ways of just Googling and finding these people and finding how to contact them and reaching out to them, and then letting your voice and your opinion be heard. And so we found that it's very impactful, and it allows us to actually have a voice and a say in what's happening in our city and in our industry.
Yeah, and that's a great moment, Jonathan. I'm going to turn over to you. One of those kinds of examples that you were just referencing, Heather, was, Jonathan, as part of your work with NIRAC, was helping lead this trip to Albany. And why don't you share with our audience here a little bit, like, how some of those legislators' reaction to some agents being in their office and coming up to Albany went down. So I turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. And it's great to see Heather, Mike, and Richard here. This is entitled Best Practices. And I think, one of the top best practices that everyone tuning in today can, if you're not already doing it, is to start getting more politically involved, as Heather mentioned. When I was working with, so first of all, NIRAC was sort of born at a very, very propitious moment. Because the politics of real estate changed drastically circa 2018. What we saw was, for the first time, it's only been a handful of times since World War II, that the Republicans, or a combination thereof, did not control the state Senate. And so for years, real estate prospered under that political paradigm. But in 2018, with the election of AOC and what we later came to know as some very, very far left-wing members of the state legislature being elected and being part of this legislature, that completely turned the politics up in Albany on its head. And so when NIRAC was born, certainly came out of a much needed purpose of, agents coming together, raising the bar when it comes to the reputation of the industry, all very, very important. But it took on even greater importance, just given the political realities that were occurring then and largely continue to this day. So the best practices of everybody tuning in today, and the message that you can convey to those in the industry who are not, is, for whatever reason, if you had an aversion to getting involved in politics, your survival of your industry is really dependent upon it. So in February of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, I brought NIRAC up to Albany. It was really the first time that agents had actually shown their face in the state capitol. It was an incredibly worthwhile trip. And the resounding feedback was, what took you so long? It was actually very, very surprising when some members had heard that agents themselves had come up there, taking nothing away from the great work that Mike Kelly and Richard Haggerty do. But when you have the stakeholders that are directly involved, it matters much more. And we need to see more of that activity. And for those in Albany, for those who are not in Albany, I should say, you really need to go up and experience a lobbying day, not only for what you can benefit out of it, but also to get a sense of some of these forces that are against your industry, what they're doing every day. As soon as you walk into the Capitol, and it's this beautiful building, if you've never been there, but you will start hearing the echoes. It's an echo chamber in there. It's a very loud building. You will start, seeing people unfurling banners and yelling and screaming. Inevitably, it is, tenant activists who are there to intimidate members, to scream loudly. And it's very, very difficult for legislators who are trying to be reasonable to withstand that type of pressure, particularly Democrats. And so I would ask and implore everyone here that if you're not involved politically up until this point, now is the time to get involved. And your voice does count. your voice does matter. And to what Heather said, everyone thinks someone else is going to do it. Well, I know that's what Rebney does, so I'll just let them do it. Or I know that, that's what National Association of Realtors or HGAR does. No, they're great in terms of having a banner and having an understanding of who the organization represents. But you, the individuals, have so much more power. And what that means specifically is you have to find out who your state legislators are. You have to find out who your city council people are, your county legislators, depending on where you live. And you have to engage with them, that when you see them, you have to explain who you are, what your business is, what the forces are that are hurting you. And we've already heard from Richard about, just generally what the economic realities are of the real estate industry here in New York. That is all being compounded by legislation that is going to take a bad situation and turn it into a much worse situation. So that just sort of sets the table for the need for advocacy, the need for involvement. And everything I think you're going to hear today will tie back into that point. So again, asking everyone who is, perhaps hearing this for the first time, get involved, join the organization you feel comfortable with, and really try to advocate for yourself, because it really does matter.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, very well said. And, I'm going to turn you to some of the, for New York City, focus on a couple of those issues now that may be, of interest to our audience and are things that they maybe should go be engaged with. But before we do that, we've got one question that's already come in our Q&A, which is from Alex Reuthmeyer. Alex, I hope I got the last name pronounced correctly. Alex asks, what best practices can local committees like HGAR use to energize its members to contact their elected officials on issues? Now, Jonathan and Heather, I might point to one of the ones that I know I sort of was a little bit involved with and witnessed alongside of helping when there was, I think this is on pied a terre. I could be wrong on which issue it was on, but on sort of sending out emails to the members with sort of a way of sort of finding their local official and then getting a message out to them. So I'm curious, I think Alex is sort of asking, what are some of those like granular tactics that can be used at an association level to help the membership get involved? And Richard, I mean, you very well might want to chime in on this one as well.
Yeah, I'd like to defer to Richard, because
Okay.
I know he's got a real practical answer to this, because this happens, he's using these tools all the time. So.
And yeah, I also, Jonathan, you're spot on in terms of really getting in front of the legislators. The New York State Association of Realtors really does an incredible job doing that, both in Albany with their lobby day, and I'm going to defer to Mike in just a second, because that lobby day has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And I know with HJR, when I was the CEO there, we'd actually have all the legislators come into one room. Andrew Stewart Cousins would arrange for us to have one of the largest rooms in the Capitol building. And it was really powerful to see about, I want to say we'd get 80 people to 100 people filling up that room, which, really, I think made an impact with the legislators. And we'd have a very organized agenda on the issues that really were local as well as statewide. And it was, I think, very impressive for the legislators to see that kind of organization. But the other thing that our National Association, New York State Association, and at the local level, we've also, at the Hudson Gateway Association level, we've done call to actions to our members, where we actually are able to connect the member to the legislators who are representing them in their district. So I'm going to defer to Mike, because I think those call to actions can be very, very effective.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Brian, thanks for having me. Here's what I'll say, Richard, thank you for the positive comments about our lobby day. I appreciate that. We're thrilled that we're able to get upwards over of 300, working practitioners and professionals to come to Albany for a day. I would suggest they're probably not coming for the fancy sandwiches that we provide. But I want to echo what Jonathan mentioned. This is why it's critical for people to be involved in politics. And Jonathan and Heather are absolutely right. A working practitioner or realtor from wherever in New York State brings a voice to the issues that I talk to lawmakers about all the time. I've been with the Realtors 22 years now. There's an ever evolving and very fluid legislature. It is trending more left than it ever has been. It's not just a Democratic majority now. The real fight is within those majorities. What does that conference look like? And I think the concern for real estate is how much farther left are we going to go? And that's the real conversation being had right now in Albany. And I think the important thing to remember is real estate professionals bring an expertise to the table to talk to their lawmakers about why they like a bill or why they have concerns about a piece of legislation that I can't, right? I mean, I represent the industry. I have a pretty good knowledge of the issues, but I'm not a practitioner. I'm not working with buyers and sellers or renters or property owners. So I'll just say that lobby day is important, but look, we send out call for actions from time to time on the most critical issues. The National Association does as well. And I'll tell you, for the most part, we don't get above 5 or 7% of a response. And why is that? I mean, is it that difficult to click on 3 buttons and tell your lawmaker that you care? I'm not certain, but we've had a difficult time doing that. So we've changed a little bit. I think lobby day is becoming more important. We're doing more and more meetings with, in particular, the city council members as they discuss things like, the broker fee issue, electrification issues in New York City specifically, with local law 97 and 154, with a potential ban on the use of criminal background checks by agents and property owners. So there's a whole host of things, both at the city and state level, that we're engaging people on. So.
And the other thing I'd suggest, and I think that this is the part of real estate that people don't like, but it's the reality. I'm sorry, the part of politics that people don't like, but it's the reality. Politicians have to raise money. It's just the reality. And quite frankly, when realtors go to those fundraisers, they get FaceTime one-on-one conversations with the decision makers. And that's invaluable to have that type of name recognition when you're then having a specific issue you have to deal with the legislators on. So whether you like it or not, having a place at the table when they are actively fundraising also is a very important component of this discussion.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to turn to one of our next Q&As questions. William Lipscomb asked, what are the top few issues that we should be educating ourselves about and advocating for or against? And Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you. We're going to start with some New York City local stuff first, and then start to expand, and Mike, come to you on some of the things, including congressional races and sort of not just issues, but also candidacies and things. So Jonathan, I'm going to start with you for New York City.
Well, Mike did a great job of touching on some of the most pressing pieces of legislation in New York City. They are in no particular order. The Chi Osei bill, which essentially is a second attempt. The first attempt was Keith Powers in 2019. Heather alluded to it. I think it was Intro 1423 at the time, where he wanted to cap. I had a bill to try and cap the percentage of the fee percentage that brokers can take on rentals. That has come back in a different form. Chi Osei's bill, which has certainly enough sponsors that it would be veto-proof if it ever came to a vote. That bill would essentially redefine the relationship between broker and tenant, whereby if someone explicitly states they want to hire a broker for the purpose of finding an apartment, you could charge a fee. But any other scenario where it's the landlord or some other entity, you wouldn't be able to charge a fee. So we're watching that very, very closely. Richard kicked this off with the industry report, and I want to pick up there because this is a good example of how things that may not seem related oftentimes are. So Richard talked about a supply problem. So the reason there's a supply problem is because the legislature got rid of 421A. This is the major tax incentive that allowed developers to build both affordable and market rate. And it's very, very important to stress that you need that healthy combination of both, because otherwise you're not properly addressing the supply. Those who have the financial resources to do so can find places, but then there's so many people in the city who don't have the financial wherewithal to find what they're looking for, because the supply is not there. I've got a 20-year-old that's living in my in-laws' place right over the border in Westchester because he tried for 6 months trying to find a rental, and he didn't want to pay it and I didn't want to pay it. And so he's living on the second floor of my in-laws' house, which, they have since, spending most of their time in Houston, Texas. And so he's got a house to himself where he doesn't pay rent. That's a fortunate situation for us, but most people don't have that opportunity. But it just goes to show how difficult it is to find anything. So until we change how we build housing in the city, you're going to continue to see these strains in the market. At some point we're going to get to Albany in the conversation, but I think it's very, very important to note that there are a number of things that we are watching right now as it relates to good cause eviction. I'd really like Richard and Mike to chime in on this, because I think their proximity to this issue is a bit closer than mine, but we're about to head into a legislative session starting January 24. And there's going to be a very serious discussion about good cause eviction that, again, is going to completely upend the way we understand, first of all, how banks finance buildings, because there's a good question as to whether or not you even know what the rent rolls are. When someone who, normally if the market dictates what's going on, you can have a sense of what the rent rolls are. There was a terrible bill that got passed in the last 48 hours of session back in June, which would again change the recipe of combining two apartments, and when you combine those apartments, what the base rent will be. So I know we're getting very, very deep into the weeds, but all of this comes back to what we said at the outset, which is there are these external forces that is going to severely, if passed and signed by the governor, that combination apartment bill has not yet been signed by the governor, but that could add further strain on what is an already difficult industry. So I don't know if Mike or Richard want to pivot off any of the ideas that I introduced, because I think that they could probably discuss it a bit better than I did.
Yeah, I'm going to pass it to Mike, but I'm going to just reiterate the common theme here. And this is why it's so important, as Heather said at the very onset. Yeah, there's some legislators, especially on the left side of the spectrum, that really are painting all tenants as victims and all landlords as predators. And we have to change that dialogue. We have to change that dynamic and not allow that perception to continue, because it doesn't benefit anybody. So I really think that's one of the challenges we have, and where we have to continue to be as vocal as we can be to make sure that we don't allow that narrative to continue. So Mike, I'm going to pass it to you though for more specifics.
Yeah, I think Jonathan's right. I would just take a step back on this good cause issue, because it's really part of a larger conversation that I think, and I'll give Governor Hochul credit for this. It's the first time I've seen an executive try and address, maybe it was because out of need, I'm not certain, but that being said, trying to address the housing crisis, right? I think this is not just, doesn't happen in the last year. This has been coming. And the expiration of 420A, we know certainly hasn't aided, the development of housing in New York City in particular. But in that housing conversation, remember, you have a lot of lawmakers that represent constituents / voters, where the percentage of rental to home ownership is 9-1 or 7-3. And so a priority for those lawmakers, there's going to be additional protections for renters. And Jonathan's right. You can go in the halls on any Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and in some days Thursday if the legislature's here, as I look at the legislative calendar from last year. and you can barely hear yourself. And it's not real estate licensees, it's not realtors, it's not members of REBNY banging cymbals and drums and throwing paper airplanes into the chamber and yelling at members and screaming at Jim Whalen as he's walking down the concourse. That's not us. That's the tenant advocates. So that group most certainly wants to see additional rental protections in this housing conversation. And that's really the crux of the issue. How does Governor Hochul and the legislature, how do they get to a meeting of the minds when Governor Hochul, at least today, and I knock on wood, has said, I'm not that fond of good cause eviction. I don't think it's the solution to our housing crisis. And you have leadership in both houses saying, absent some additional rental protections, we're not going to be signing off on any housing deal. So as I look towards 2024, the governor's executive proposed budget for the next year that's going to come out sometime in mid-January, I think that's the $1 million question for me is, what does the governor's housing proposal look like? And is there any piece of what are there any other additional rental protections in her proposal? And what does that look like? And I think that's probably, for me, the largest conversation happening in 2024.
Yeah, I think I'm reading through this. I'm going to sort of try to weave these two questions together a little bit. Anthony Domathodi asks, what are the implications of the rental broker bill and how might it impact both landlords and tenants in our area? And then we have another question, which is a little bit more of commentary, but sort of feeds, is different, but might feed into the same answering. Rent stabilized housing must have a vacancy reset provision if these aging buildings are to survive. We have to press for the AM Kenny Burgos bill. The Bronx chapter is working with our Senate and Assembly members and need NYSAR and HGAR assistance. So I don't know if Mike, you were sort of nodding and things there. Do you want to sort of chime in or comment to those, or Jonathan?
Yeah, I'll comment on the last one first, and someone else can talk about it. The Kenny Burgos bill. Yeah, we're definitely supportive of and familiar with it. I think you're right. I mean, there are a lot of buildings with rent stabilized units that remain vacant, right? Thousands upon thousands of units that could be in the rental space that could help reduce rents. It's the supply and demand. And, you know, as I understand it, folks are sitting on those properties because they're reluctant to invest X into the building and into those units if you can only recoup X minus a whole lot more, and they don't see it as a possibility for a return on their investment. So I think whoever made that comment is spot on, and I think that's what the Burgos bill's trying to get to. The challenge for us is that bill, along with a whole lot of other pro real estate bills, as I generically call them, have a tremendous uphill battle in a very progressive legislature.
Yeah. Jonathan, go for it.
I don't know if Heather wants to talk about the impact of the
broker, the rental broker.
The rental broker. Heather, do you want to take this? You're really on the front line of this.
You know, it's interesting. I know that there are two differing opinions on this bill. And there are some people that feel as long as they're not capping commissions and it's about who's to pay for the commission, then there are people supporting it. Wherein I know, and I think HGAR and REBNY are at odds in this. Am I correct, Richard?
Yeah. I think the devil's in the details, quite frankly, but I think, you know, at the end of the day, both REBNY and HJR want to see more inventory available, and will broadly try to support any legislation that is going to create more inventory in general, depending upon what the other negative details that may be included.
Yeah. Well, I want to keep us going because there is, we've got a lot of other good stuff to sort of speak to here. Mike, do you want to turn and talk a little bit about some of the congressional races, some of the candidates and their positions as it relates to our industry? Oh, Mike,
Sorry, I apologize. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that folks, Heather talked about, the genesis of her group reaching out directly to lawmakers to express their concerns. I think I love that so much, because all it does really is provides another voice in the halls of Albany, in the halls of city council downtown. And as I look towards these 2024 elections, I think it's important to remember that there's an opportunity here for us to weigh in. Richard had mentioned we do it very often via our political action committee. I think just at the end of the day, my ask always, at least of our own members, is, listen, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but you need to vote, right? Lawmakers need to know that real estate votes, and I think that's really, really important. The one thing I'll say, I won't get into too granular of detail, is as I looked at some of the House races more recently, you'll remember that the House flipped in 2022, and that change was in large part because of a flip of 4 or 5 seats in New York State that went from D to R. And that, listen, we all saw the machinations of government a week ago. I don't know if anybody stayed up and watched C-SPAN like I did, but it was amazing to watch this debate with Matt Gaetz and what the ability of a small number of lawmakers are able to do in the U.S. House and determine the control of that House. And that trickles down to, I want everybody to know this, that trickles down to the outcomes of 7, as I describe them, as very close or toss-up seats in New York State. And those include the upstate Syracuse area, 22nd congressional district, currently held by Brandon Williams. State Senator John Mannion, Democrat, is going to be challenging him. Representative Williams only won by less than a point last time, about 2,500 votes. Moving downstate, the 19th congressional district, currently held by Republican Mark Molinaro. He's once again going to face in a rematch Josh Riley. Riley only lost by 4,500 votes. The 18th congressional district, currently held by Pat Ryan, a Democrat, going to be challenged by a real estate broker, Lovely Gwynn. The 17th congressional district in Rockland and parts of Westchester, Mike Lawler, former Republican state assembly member, is in a toss-up race, but the district is G+3, which means it leans Democrat. So Mr. Lawler is going to be challenged by either Mondaire Jones probably or Liz Garrity. And the 4th congressional district on the island, Anthony D'Esposito is going to be challenged by current state senator, Democrat Kevin Thomas on Long Island. George Santos, the current representative, is, I think, facing challenges from all fronts at this point. I think Republicans want to get him out in time so they can get a new candidate in, because that new candidate is just more recently, we found out, going to be facing former Representative Tom Suozzi. We'll remember Tom Suozzi resigned from his seat so he could, or didn't decide to run for re-election, so he could run for governor, and lost in Democratic primary against Governor Hochul. And then way out east, Nick LaLota probably it will hold on to win, but it's going to be close. He's running against a former state senator in Jim Gorin. So my point being is, members and people on this call and beyond that, it's very important to remember that all the issues that we talked a little bit about, and this is just a handful of them, it's critically important for you to get involved legislatively, politically, and make your voice heard, whether it's through an individual basis, as Heather has done with her organization, or a group like REBNY, Hudson Gateway, or the New York State Association of Realtors.
Yeah. And can I chime in on one issue that's both state and, quite frankly, very specific to our region, is co-op transparency legislation. That's been on the table for quite some time.
Years, yeah.
We are very, very big proponents of it. Brian, as you know, this topic has come up when we've talked about co-ops in general, but it's one of the top priorities for the New York State Association of Realtors, and has always been a top priority for the Hudson Gateway Association, because we think that also will stimulate a more transparent purchase process. And quite frankly, as somebody who's always lived in co-ops and owned co-ops, help destigmatize the co-op purchase process, because a lot of people say, I don't want to go through that approval process, because they know it can drag out. They know that they may, if they get rejected, they don't know the reason why. And yeah, I really believe that that's another prime example of real estate professionals. If they get involved in that conversation directly with their legislators, it can really be impactful, because I think the management companies have demonized that issue. And from my perspective, most shareholders in a co-op would want to have that transparency. And I really think that we could get over the finish line if we get more engaged on that issue, because I think it's a win-win for everybody. Heather, I'm not sure where Rebney is on that issue, but I think occasionally they've not been fully supportive of it. But I think that it really does make sense for the real estate industry and for consumers, because everything we do, we have to make a pro-consumer argument. So co-op transparency, I think, has got to always be at the top of our agenda.
Yeah. Heather, I'll go to you first, and then Jonathan, I saw you come off mute as well, because to chime in here.
I would definitely agree about the co-op transparency. And, it just seems to be something that just never gets moved along. It always gets put on the back burner. But I think one of the things that people need to understand is that there are very strong interest groups on the other side of these issues that are showing up. And when we went to Albany, one of the things I heard a couple of times was, because when the rent laws were passed in 2019, then we had a lot of unintended consequences. And when we started talking about these unintended consequences, we learned that there were droves of people coming up on the opposite side of this interest that were really putting a lot of pressure and influence over our representatives. And it's just the fact that they were showing up that really made the difference. And so when we've got these other interest groups that are showing up, but we ourselves are not showing up, and we are not taking as much interest in these issues, there's nobody there to oppose them. So that's a big reason why a lot of these laws do get passed in, because there's just not enough. And when you think about it, if we just continue to rely and we don't take action, we rely on REBNY or NAR or HGAR, all of those organizations, they're one voice that is heard over and over and over every single year. Think about if you have a listing and you're that one person telling a seller the same thing over and over, and it's just, you end up parting ways, or you lose a listing, and then the seller hears the same thing from the next person, and then they listen to that next person. It's the same thing. It's the same thing in a marriage too, right? Like if your husband hears it from somebody else and you've been telling him the same thing over and over, it's like it finally clicks because they hear it from somebody else. And so hearing from multiple voices instead of just that one voice really does make an impact. So that's why I think it is so important, and why this panel even exists, is to compel all of us to actually use our voices, because we just can't rely on that one voice. They do a great job and they work really hard for us, but we need to support them in return.
I'll just make one quick point, and Mike, I think we worked together on this. So it's funny when you think about this conversation in historical terms, it's almost like, there's BC and AD, and I think 2019 is sort of that dividing line. There was like BC before 2019 and then AD after 2019, because that's when, all the rules and regulations over real estate went through. But, one correction that came out of there, it didn't happen in 2020, but it happened in 2021, is the Ed Braunstein, John Liu bill, which redefined, there was agents in particular and co-ops as well, we're losing out. You have tenants who come in and they're sort of borderline on the finances, and there's a long-standing practice to take years of maintenance and put it in escrow to make sure that it gets paid. And the 2019 rules called into question as whether or not that would contravene those laws. And so Ed Braunstein put in a bill and it was fixed. And, now more and more people can avail themselves of that long-standing practice. So, I think it was part of the NIRAC agenda in 2020, didn't get it done that year. It was probably a little situation of too soon, but in 2021, it was fixed. And so there is opportunity for things to be tweaked. Everything we're talking about, the supply issue, the vacant, we were talking about earlier, the Kenny Burgos bill. I mean, for anyone who tuned into those hearings, chaired by Linda Rosenthal, I mean, this was actually predicted. They said, landlords came forward and said, it's going to cost us more money to fix a building that has lead and needs abatement and all this other stuff. It's just in our incentive to keep it vacant. And, the typical response was, you real estate people, you're always crying wolf. It's always a disaster, but you're making so much money. So now we see it coming to fruition, and nobody wants to acknowledge they were wrong. If anything, they want to sort of double down on it to make sure that, any loophole or fix to the problem can't get done. So, it's sort of the ultimate example of gaslighting that you could ever think of in this, for the purpose of this discussion.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important point, because the person who had asked the question about Kenny Burgos's bill initially is Anthony Domitotti, who's a past president of the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors, who is one of those individuals who goes to all of the events. And Kenny's actually he's a straight shooter. He says, I'm not always going to support your issues, but I'm always going to listen to you. And that's where you got to have those open lines of communication. And they also don't want you always, just saying you're wrong. They want you to consider some of their legislation that they're supporting to see if you can get on board. And those relationships are vital. I mean, I see Leah Caro, who was, filled in for me on occasion as the host, and Leah's legislative chair for the Hudson Gateway, and she's got a great relationship with Shelley Mayer. So you've always got to, we can't just be so focused on one issue. We also have to be relationship focused, as Heather talked about, and be willing to talk about a whole range of issues that we both support and potentially oppose, and just be willing to have that open dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. I do want to do this. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to wrap with Heather sort of coming back, and in fact, Calvin Lee just sort of asked a question, or asked for like, hey, how do we go get involved? And Heather, you've got some good commentary on that. But briefly, I want to touch on the sort of NAR lawsuit situation, which is its own, not quite politics and legislation issue, but is its own issue for agents to sort of be aware of and tuned in an almost political kind of sense. So Richard, I'm going to turn that over to you for maybe just a quick 2 to 3 minute informational summary for some of our audience here.
So, I could go on for a whole hour.
Right.
I would actually do this in about a minute.
Yeah.
There's several lawsuits. One is actually going to go to trial on Monday that involves the National Association of Realtors. I think there's still 2 franchises in there. I think it's Home Services, Berkshire Hathaway, and Keller Williams. Anywhere Real Estate, which covers Century 21, ERA, all those groups. They settled for, I believe, $70 million in change a couple of weeks ago. Remax also settled for $50 million in change. So they're out of a couple of those big lawsuits. But it all boils down to consumers and making sure that all of our practices benefit consumers. In the case of several of those lawsuits, it really deals with compensation and whether the sellers, quite frankly, were negatively impacted by being, quote unquote, required to pay compensation to agents working with buyers. I think that the industry has really been very fluid and has offered a lot of consumer choice for many years. And I'm hoping that the courts recognize that. The One Key MLS recently just acknowledged that 0 is a legitimate offer of compensation. Brokers can't just make that decision that they're not going to offer compensation to agents who are working with buyers. They've got to do it in consultation with seller clients if you're the listing broker, because you've got to do what's going to be best for both. If you're a seller's agent, what's best for the seller? If you're a buyer's agent, what's best for the buyer? But just understand that these lawsuits potentially are going to have a huge impact on the way we do business. And I think it could even potentially have an impact on the discussions that are going on with the city council bill concerning compensation for tenant agents. At the same time, if we look at everything through the lens of are we benefiting the consumer, I think we're going to be on pretty solid ground. The challenging thing is it's not just these court decisions, it's also the Department of Justice. Right now, the Department of Justice is weighed in on every single one of the lawsuits. And I think that we need a reset with the regulatory body, because they right now are very they're anti our industry. And we have to really have a conversation that says we are here to benefit the consumers and have a very persuasive argument. So the problem is this is not a legislative issue. This is, these court decisions, we don't have a say here. So we've just got to be aware of them, and we've got to make sure that we're always talking about a pro-consumer environment and how we benefit the transaction.
Yeah, well, with that, Richard, well said. And I want to turn to you, Heather, to sort of bring us home a little bit around, as an agent and broker, speaking to our audience of agents, brokers, and realtors, sort of speaking a bit about how to sort of carry this out and why, and sort of how to present yourself, and think, you have some great commentary about how to think about yourself as an independent business, really, above and beyond the brokerage for whom you work. And Calvin, you had a great question. You're asking for like really specific action items of an email blast with various organizations, short-term, long-term goals. I think that is up to the different trade associations and organizations like NIRAC to help share those activities, not necessarily this webinar. But I would encourage you, Calvin, after you hear Heather's commentary, to dig in and go seek out those resources. I'm not sure where you're located, whether you're in which territory, which associations you belong to, but those resources are there to be engaged with. So with that, Heather, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I'll say some final words.
Great, thank you very much. So listen, I think the one thing that our representatives do not understand is that we are independent contractors and what that exactly means. So, at the end of the day, we are small business owners. And as soon as you start speaking to representatives about being a small business owner, because, every government is pro small business owners, right? Because it's the small businesses that keep the economy going. And so as soon as you can relate that to these representatives, we're small business owners, even though we work for a brokerage, we are independent contractors, and we are not we have a lot of bills and expenses that, it might look very flashy on TV. With reality TV, that hasn't helped us at all. It looks like we all make lots and lots of money. The average agent, I think, makes around $60,000 to $70,000, or $70,000 a year. And, then you've got your business expenses and your taxes and everything. Mm-hmm. So, on average, real estate agents, it's not a super profitable profession, but all the media sees and all our representatives sees is what's on reality TV. And then the people who are big and splashy and have big social media presence and make our business look like everybody's rolling in cash. And so people need to understand that. When we met with Keith Powers, we brought in someone who is a rental broker that they track everything in QuickBooks. And it was like, these are our expenses line by line by line. This is what we pay people. This is what the company takes, you know, like what our split is on our commission. And then this is what we're left with. It was like when we brought the rental brokers in, they started at 600,000 and two partners were making $75,000 after 600,000 in GCI. So, you know, our government representatives don't understand these things. So that's part of the importance of showing up, is sharing that message with people and having them understand that we are all hardworking small business owners. And so the ways to do that is, when you're, you know, make sure you're getting your emails from your boards, whether it's NAR, HGAR, REBNY, make sure you've opted in, not out of those emails, because there's a lot of information that comes in from the government relations. I'm assuming since you're on this call, you probably have opted in, but you can always talk to your peers also and remind them that it is important to be opted into these emails, even though you might find the so many emails annoying. It's important. And then volunteering when they need the help and stepping up. And then also, you know, don't be afraid. If you catch something, you read something in the news, or there's something that's bothering you, you can go online. There's a directory for every representative, state, local, US even, but there's a directory, and you can send in an email and a message to your representatives about what is on your mind. You might get a blanket response, but at least they're getting it, and keep on sending it, and encourage your peers to send the messages. So that's really how you can start making a difference. And those little teeny emails, those messages, it freaks them out, and they care. They care more than you think. It's not just going to an empty nowhere box where they're ignoring you.
Very well said, Heather. A lot of passion there. Well, I want to say we're at a little bit over the hour. I really try to always be close on the hour, but Heather, there was so much passion there. We've covered a lot of great topics. A huge shout out of thanks and appreciation to you, Heather, Richard, Jonathan, Mike. Thank you for being here with us. I think this is another great session. I really feel like these are those kind of things where, to use the adage, like a stitch in time can save nine. This is like this kind of engagement at this granular level can really have outsized impact in sort of what happens in our larger ecosystem. So a huge shout out of thanks, especially to Gary and the whole HGIR team behind the scenes who help make these webinars happen. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Be Your Best series. Take care and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.